There is the
second example.
this
Sentence.
is about the second transitivity of past participle that is applied as an adjective to describe how the subject is in the clause stated in the passive voice of the speaker. I am sent the heavenly bliss from the Reverend instantly when I choose to be grateful. The transitive verb send is able to be applied by the speaker who focuses on the transition from the subject to the indirect object via the direct object. This clause
I am sent the heavenly bliss from the Reverend instantly.
is stated in the passive voice of the speaker who focuses on the indirect object. This clause is stated from the perspective of the indirect object. The speaker considers the indirect object to receive the definition of the transitive verb send as a
Premise
and the direct object
that is conveyed after the definition of the transitive verb.
So the indirect object becomes the subject of this clause stated in the passive voice.
The speaker as the subject
Is described by the be verb am and the past participle sent
as a subjective complement.
to reveal the fact that the object
And the clause stated in the active voice
receives the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject, the Reverend. So we can say that the first transitivity of the transitive verb send is applied to reveal the fact that the indirect object receives the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject, the Reverend.
and the clause stated in the active voice.
So the first transitivity is applied already, and
This is obvious with the form of the past participle sent.
the verb form of the past participle sent is able to be revealed in the transitive verb send that has the second transitivity to give the definition of the transitive verb send to
The object, the heavenly bliss, as the object of the subjective complement sent. That is,
the direct object, the heavenly bliss.
and the clause stated in the active voice.
The heavenly bliss is also conveyed to the indirect object, the speaker,
And the clause stated in the active voice.
stated as the subject in this clause. In the passive voice, this is obvious that the subject, the Reverend, gives the definition of the transitive verb send and the direct object, the heavenly bliss. the first transitivity of the transitive verb send is applied, and
the object of the subjective complement, the heavenly bliss, that is the direct object in the clause in the active voice,
receives the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject, the referent.
from the second transitivity of the transitive verb send.
So we can understand that the definition of the transitive verb send is conveyed to
The object of the subjective complement, the heavenly bliss, as
direct object in the clause stated in the active voice. So we can understand that the clause stated in the active voice
and the sentence
is this: the reverend sent me the heavenly bliss instantly when I choose to be grateful. The past participle sent conveys the definition of the transitive verb sent to the object, the heavenly bliss, of the subjective complement sent of the clause I am sent the heavenly bliss from the reverend instantly, which the past participle sent originates from. This clause in a passive voice describes the three relationships among an object indicated by the phrase of the noun the reverend
as
the object of the preposition from, an object of the subjective complement indicated by the phrase of the noun the heavenly bliss, and a subject indicated by the personal pronoun I. There is the
third example. Example.
Stated in the active voice. The reverend sends me the heavenly bliss instantly when I choose to be grateful. The clause in the active voice describes the definition of the verb send conveyed from the subject, the referent, to the indirect object, me, via the direct object, the heavenly bliss. The point is that each object, the indirect object, indicated by the personal pronoun me, and the direct object, indicated by the phrase of the abstract noun the heavenly bliss, is conveyed the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject, the reverend. We can understand that
The terms
the direct object and the indirect object
tell us
the order to receive the definition of the verb, of the transitive verb from the subject. The direct object receives the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject at first, and the indirect object receives the definition of the transitive verb send from the subject at second. The past participle sent in the clause stated in the passive voice from the perspective of the speaker describes the two relationships between the subject and the indirect object, and between the direct object and the indirect object. The object of the subjective complement in the clause stated in the passive voice is the direct object in the clause stated in the active voice. We will interpret this clause stated in the passive voice from the clause stated in the active voice. We can understand that the transitive verb send is transformed into an object to describe the condition of the speaker, who is the indirect object in the clause stated in the active voice. We can also understand that the relationship
among
the subject, the referent, the direct object, the heavenly bliss, and the indirect object me is constant when the voice to state the sentence is changed. The object, the indirect object becomes the subject, and the direct object becomes the object of the subjective complement sent that is a transitive verb in the clause stated in the active voice. So we can understand the relationship between the subject, the speaker, and the object of the subjective complement, the heavenly bliss, is the relationship between the indirect object and the direct object in the clause stated in the active voice. The direct object and the indirect object. And we can also understand the relationship between the speaker and the object of the preposition from, the referent is in the relationship between the subject and the indirect object. The subject, the referent, and the indirect object. This phenomenon is caused by the dual transitivity of the transitive verb send. The first transitivity is about the form of the past participle to describe the object in a subject-object relationship.
in the clause stated in the passive voice, the speaker is described by the past participle sent to reveal that the speaker is the indirect object in the clause stated in the active voice.
And the second transitivity is about the definition to be conveyed to the object.
The object, the heavenly bliss, conveys the definition of the transitive verb send as the object of the subjective complement send.
The fact that the definition of the transitive verb send is conveyed from the direct object to the indirect object according to the transition from the subject is revealed, obviously, in the clause stated in the passive voice. The relationship between the indirect object and the direct object is constant to receive the definition of the transitive verb from the subject, the referent, in the clause stated in the active voice. So we can understand that the definition of the transitive verb, that is the verb form of the past participle, is conveyed to the object, the heavenly bliss, that is the direct object in the clause stated in the active voice. The fact that the relationships between the subject and the object remain the same from each voice to state the clause. The past participle sent describes the speaker in a condition with the be verb. To get the action sent from the object indicated by the phrase of the noun, the referent of the preposition from, whose subject is also the speaker as the subject. And the speaker to get the object indicated by the phrase of the noun, the heavenly bliss, which is the object of the subjective complement sent. This explanation is about the indirect object. The indirect object receives the definition of the transitive verb at first and the direct object at second. In a clause stated in the passive voice, the direct object can be the subject. The speaker who states the clause in the from the perspective of the direct object applies the preposition from and to. We can understand that the object of the preposition from is the subject
as the resource
of the verb, of the transitive verb. And we can also understand that the object of the preposition to is the indirect object
as the orientation.
This clause is stated from the perspective of the indirect object.
And
The speaker didn't apply the preposition from twice. The speaker does not apply the two prepositions from to reveal
that the indirect object
is in the two subject and object relationships with the subject and the direct object. From the perspective of the indirect object,
the direct object is stated to receive the definition of the transitive verb as the object of the subjective complement. To clarify that the conveyance of the definition that the transitive verb conveys is constant from the subject to the direct object.
the speaker states the indirect object described by the be verb and the past participle is an adjective. So we can understand that a clause stated in the passive voice is about the condition of the subject. The form of the past participle as the subjective complement reveals that the indirect object is the object in the subject and in the indirect object relationship. So the subject of the clause stated in the active voice becomes the object of the preposition from. And the direct object is the heavenly place. The heavenly place is the conveyance of the direct object. The heavenly place is reliant on the conveyance of the definition of the transitive verb send. So the description by the adjective sent becomes the premise that the direct object is conveyed to the indirect object that becomes the subject of the clause stated in the passive voice. So we can understand that the definition of the transitive verb is like a carrier, and the direct object is conveyed through the definition of the transitive verb
as
the carrier. So this relationship, the past participle is an adjective, and the direct object then becomes the object of the subjective complement sent, reveals this reliant relationship between the definition of the transitive verb sent and the direct object. The point is that each object is conveyed the definition of the transitive verb sent from the subject the way around. Thank you for watching.